Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. On behalf of the Cities Alliance Secretariat, I am happy to welcome you to this webinar today on smart technologies for more equitable city economies. My name is Keith Mudadi, and I am a program analyst at Cities Alliance based in Brussels, and I am going to moderate the discussion today. The webinar has been organized by the Joint Work Program for Fostering Equitable Economic Growth in Cities. The Joint Work Program is chaired by the UK Department for International Development. Before we start, I will give you just a bit of background information on the Joint Work Program. So the Joint Work Program is a 4-year program that aims to understand and address the link between public service provision and equitable economic trajectories in cities. The main question that the Joint Work Program seeks to address is what advice can we give to a mayor of a secondary city with limited resources if he wants to foster productivity of the informal and formal sector and increase access to public goods and services. The Joint Work Program works across 3 work streams with local governments, city stakeholders, and other development partners to produce global knowledge, facilitate policy dialogues, and support city-level diagnostics and policy recommendations to respond to the challenges of inequitable economic growth in cities. Last year, the Joint Work Program engaged a French consulting firm, Espelia, to investigate case studies that demonstrate how technology can be used to foster equitable economic growth in cities. This comes against a background of increased interest in the concept of smart cities, not only in global dialogues and discourses, but also in informing development approaches and policy responses by local governments in rapidly urbanizing partner countries of the Cities Alliance. However, country operations of the Cities Alliance suggest that these approaches often fall short of producing inclusive and poor outcomes and are difficult to apply in data and investment scarce environments, especially in secondary cities of the global south. The report from the study that was carried out by Espelia intends to suggest a revised understanding of the smart city concept based upon evidence and ideas from cities around the world, and to identify technologies applicable to data scarce environments aimed at reducing inequalities and to foster more inclusive urban economies. The report will be made available next month, hopefully, and we are still working on it. We're still finalizing the report, and the purpose of this webinar is to discuss the findings from that study. So before we start, I would like to introduce our panelists today. We are joined today by Lo Kiwik, urban development consultant for Espelia. We also have Blanche Vallée, she's a mobility and urban development consultant at Espelia. We are also joined by Anne Janssen, who is an urban environment specialist here at Cities Alliance. And I'm also happy to welcome Vishvesh BS, who is a program officer for UNDP India. Vishvesh specializes in information technology for plastic waste management. I am Keith Mudadi and program analyst at Cities Alliance. I'm going to moderate the discussion. The webinar will be about 1 hour long, and we are going to have a presentation from Blanche and Lo, which will last approximately 25 minutes, after which we will have 2 5-minute commentaries from Anne and Vishvesh. I encourage you all to participate in the discussion by asking questions. You have 3 options to ask questions. You can type them in the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can use the chat function. If for some reason this does not work for you, you can send your questions to me via email. And my email address is kmudadi@citiesalliance.org. That's KMUDADI@citiesalliance.org. At this point, I would like to give the floor to Blanche. Blanche, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Keith. So the objective of the report we are presenting you today with Laure is to look at ways smart technologies can or could contribute to the inclusion of the urban poor in developing and fast-growing cities. So for this, we divided our presentation into 4 main sections. So I'll first go through the introduction and I'll present you the penetration of ICTs in the Global South. Then we'll go through our conceptual model detailing all the potential impacts of ICTs in urban context. And then we'll briefly talk about 2 case studies we worked on, one in Tanzania focusing on pay-as-you-go solar, and one in India focusing on waste management. And finally, Laure will present you our theory of change, highlighting some course of action for international partners. So first, smart technologies developed at an unprecedented rate in the last decade, and they encompass a very broad range of technical tools. And among these, ICTs, however, have the fastest rate of penetration in the Global South, and mobile phones are seen to be the key driver contributing to the explosion in the use of ICTs in developing countries. However, this digital revolution requires a huge financial, but also human and social investment. And all these changes have led international donors in the last few years to innovate in their approaches to ICTs, progressively shifting from financing infrastructures to financing capacity activities, entrepreneurship support, and support to digital literacy. So our paper adopted a broad understanding of the concept of equitable economic growth. We looked first at livelihoods, employment, and economic opportunities, but also at access to basic services and inclusion in urban planning and policy design on the other hand. And as for our understanding of the digital practices, we abandoned in our research the best practices emerging from northern or primary cities, and we rather focused on actual uses of ICTs by urban dwellers in ordinary cities of the Global South. That means uses that are really embedded in local dynamics. And we then crossed these 2 approaches, and that led us to 3 questions to answer in the context of secondary cities. So the first one being, what is the real potential and impact of new technologies in rapidly urbanizing cities? The second one being, to what extent technology-related changes actually contribute to the inclusion of the urban poor? And the last one being, what can stakeholders do to foster this potential? As for our research methodology, we formulated some key assumptions consisting of preconditions of an ICT enabling environment. So we tackled changes and possibilities which were created by the arrival of ICTs in cities with already existing infrastructures and platforms. And we also based our study on the assumption that the urban poor and their counterparts are digitally equipped and literate. That means that they at least own a mobile phone. We also assumed that there was a transparent governance, and this approach excluded e-governance and e-administration tools and processes that were partially left aside in this research. So our focus was then set, as Keith mentioned, on a revised understanding of the smart cities in the Global South and on the new relations that emerge directly from third parties, so urban dwellers and businesses. So as for the state of the art, we looked at the concept of smart cities which emerge in the global north, and that seems to be more idealistic than adequate for the global south for several reasons, but especially because it appears to be a top-down and supply-driven, and it seems to overlook the dynamics of the informal sector in the global south, and also because the over-reliance on data silences the challenges for the urban poor. So to enrich this smart city approach with an international development lens, we went through contribution from the field of ICTs for development, which we call ICT4D. And this field states that ICTs are socio-technical systems, and they are not just hardware and software, but they also involve people, processes, and institutions. So this field proposes to adopt a demand-driven approach where the poor or the digitally excluded are not just beneficiaries of developmental charity, but real agents for change. However, due to its histories, the case studies on ICT4D have mainly been conducted in rural areas, and most of the initiatives actually cover the fields of education or healthcare or agri-tech, for instance. So in the end, when we went through our literature review, crossing the concept of smart cities and the ICT4D literature, we found out that actually very few literature focuses on urban tech in fast-growing cities of the urban south and on ICTs for urban development. But so even though there is very little work that has been conducted on these questions for now, there is still a real excitement around the digital solutions in cities of the global south. So we reviewed the observed impacts of ICT4D in urban settings by categorizing the outputs per sector and per dimension of urban inclusion. So we first focus, as you see on the left side of the slide, on economic inclusion, notably through employment and through the concept of e-formality that was developed by the International Labour Organization. We also look at how ICTs can participate in increasing the performance of SMEs and how they can expand business opportunities. And in terms of social spatial inclusion, we also reviewed how ICTs can enhance access of the urban poor to various urban services. And finally, we looked at how new technologies can contribute to putting informal settlements on the map. Several initiatives, for instance, aim at generating data on informal settlements to raise the voice of the urban poor. And some participatory tools have also been developed to ensure some proper crisis management based on digital solutions. So once we reviewed that, three observations emerged. The first one being that access and uses of mobile phones are pervasive and access is mostly individual. The second one being that most of the initiatives emerge from third parties and are still at an early stage and concentrated in primary cities. And finally, even though some ICT-based solutions can enhance livelihoods of the urban poor, this improvement does not necessarily go hand in hand with social and political inclusion. So even though also there are a lot of ICT-related outputs, the processes through which they are to happen present some constant mechanisms. We identified three main levers that fulfill distinct functions. The first one being an operation function with access to new markets and less barriers to entry. The second one being a transactional effect with reduced transaction costs and reduced asymmetries of information. And the third one being informational uses, so that encompasses public visibility and evidence of off-the-map informal dynamic. But technology and data are no silver bullet, and still the social and political contexts are highly decisive for ICT deployment and also for their appropriation by the urban poor. We also, during our literature review, identified some political risk and some trade-offs. The first one being the withdrawal from public responsibilities. We identified that there might be a risk that third-party actors compensate for public deficiencies. And so these relations must remain regulated. And the second risk is the exclusion of the poorest of the poor, because the deployment of smart technologies may push away the poorest of the poor when these technologies are too sophisticated. And finally, we also identified that there might be economic and urban trade-offs because the capital requirements of introducing sophisticated technologies is in itself a political choice, and there might be a trade-off between the smart upgrading of existing services and the conventional expansion of public services to the underserved. So these results shall, however, be tempered, and we illustrated this conceptual model with 2 case studies. I won't go into much details in it because Arne and Wisvesh will talk about this sector just after us. So the first case studies was focusing on pay-as-you-go solutions for off-grid solar in the city of Arusha in Tanzania, and the second one on e-management of waste in Bangalore. So Arusha is the second city of Tanzania, and the population growth in the city has led to widespread horizontal urbanization in surrounding rural areas and in informal and underserviced settlements. And as a regional headquarters, Arusha is also home to various international organizations and has attracted many expatriates and foreign entrepreneurs, notably in the energy sector. So today, officially, 80% of the population in the region have access to grid electricity, but 42% of the urban households report power interruptions. So the government of Tanzania has announced ambitious electrification programs, but connecting the whole country will require huge investments, which are reaching amounts going way beyond the current allocated budget. So in that context, the off-grid solar market expanded very rapidly, with companies who capitalized on the penetration of mobile money in East Africa. So new technologies, so both solar home systems and mobile payments have unlocked business models and reduced entry barriers in the off-grid sector. And mobile technologies run these systems in various ways. For instance, the payments are collected and the credits are managed through mobile money. The product and the services are also remotely monitored. And on the user side, mobile pay-as-you-go can also empower and build capacity for the users, in particular because payment through mobile money reduces time and cost related to bill payment, but also because this scheme to also contribute to both financial and digital inclusion of the users. These solutions give them an access to a credit for the first time, and it offers them also some flexibility as for the frequency of the payment. So this is particularly valuable for the people with seasonal incomes. And that way, the client can get a credit score and they can also upgrade for income generating products and activities. And that's especially the case for women. However, we identified some challenges related to the emergence of these mobile-based solutions. In particular, the pay-as-you-go solar business is highly capital-intensive and it faces, in consequence, much financial fragility. And this situation led pay-as-you-go companies to strengthen their credit screening process. And this logic presents a risk of favoring reliable and promising clients at the expense of the most vulnerable. So to overcome this tension between the social impact and the economic prospects, some companies that we met are now looking at innovative collective partnership schemes, because they thought that the individualization that was created by the use of mobile technologies actually jeopardizes access for the poorest who are facing difficulties in paying off their debts. And so now some companies tend to capitalize on the strong social ties that are linking both the formal and the informal communities together in Tanzania, for instance, through cooperatives. And finally, also from a governance point of view, we identified some key lessons from that case studies. Maybe the most important one being that these pay-as-you-go companies are, for the moment, considered as complementary providers by public authorities, but that will raise the issue of the regulation in the long run. So I'll now give the floor to Laure for the second part.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, Laure, you can proceed.
Okay, yes, I'm sharing my screen. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so hi everyone. So I will keep on presenting you the second case of this study, which is on the use of ICTs in waste management in Bangalore. So Bangalore is one of the second.
Hello, hello.
Firms and
Hello, we are losing you. We cannot hear you.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you try again now? I think maybe it will work this time.
Yeah, and so Bangalore was facing from crisis in terms of waste management, where even though there were bylaws for waste management with at-source segregation, these bylaws were little implemented, and therefore the waste was neither segregated nor properly disposed of. And so with a lot of informal waste pickers, poor workers who collect around 1.5 tons per day, 500 tons per day. So facing this crisis in Bangalore, few local NGOs or startups or social enterprises have started to work in the sector. They are mainly committed to improving work conditions and revenues of few years, more and more to new technologies to increase their efficiency and also contribute to improving work conditions of waste pickers, which is, so we are going to look now at what kind of technologies they are using and what for in their operations of waste management. So if we go through the waste value chain, we can start first of all at the level of households and how households do dispose of their waste. It shall be noted that there have been quite high expectations on Uber-like platforms for door-to-door waste collections where households could results and impacts of this kind have been very, very limited, mainly because there's actually a very low demand on behalf of households for waste management services. And therefore, even though the municipal body of Bangalore do use GPS or CCTVs to track down the waste trucks or civic tech applications that have been developed for complaint management, there's very, very little uptake on behalf of households for these. However, some of these NGOs, social enterprises, which entered the sector of waste management for the last 5 to 10 years, have actually increasingly used new technologies to improve the efficiency of their collection system. So they, for example, use QR codes of routes of the truck, and all these technological solutions are integrated into applications that have been developed to follow up and monitor the waste collection circuit. However, once the waste is collected and centralized, there is actually, until now, very little use of other new technologies such as connected weighing scales, artificial intelligence for sorting the waste, or 3D printing. These are very, very little developed and used until now, mainly because of the upfront cost needed to invest in these. This does not mean, however, that new technologies have not changed deeply the way these actors are working in the sector, mainly because it has allowed the generation of a lot of data. And so they now have dashboards on the qualities and the quantities of the waste they are handling. But also this has been facilitated and accelerated by a law, a national law at the Indian level on extended producer responsibility, which requires waste producing firms to actually trace back the volumes of waste they allow for recycling. And so these waste producing firms have turned towards these local NGOs and social enterprises to actually get this data on recycling waste. And therefore, this has created new business and commercial opportunities for the local stakeholders. So to sum up, all along the waste value chain, actually, ICTs have not directly changed the working conditions of waste pickers. However, they are used local stakeholders who have therefore increased their business opportunities and increased their efficiency and management efficiency. And since they are opted to the inclusion of these poor workers, this has somehow trickled down to improvement of working conditions for them. But it's still quite contingent and indirect effects. So what can we learn from this case study? Well, if we look at the feedback from the stakeholders themselves, what are the lessons or the advice they would give? First of all, what they say is that simplicity, frugality, and accessibility of the design of the functionalities of the apps and the technological tools that are used is key so that it can be still quite early stage, and they are quite limited in terms of they are like very often at the level of pilots with very fragile business models, low demand from the households, and therefore they are highly dependent on grants and external financial support. However, the law on extended producer responsibility and therefore the data business opportunities may present a potential there to scale up and replicate these initiatives. In terms of governance and inclusion, there is some kind of a mild conclusion that we can get. First of all, at the individual level, we can notice that actually male workers are much more exposed to ICTs than women because they are in charge of the collection and the transportation of waste, while women are more at the tasks of sorting the waste, meaning they are actually more on manual intensive tasks. Also, even though Bangalore is part of the Silicon Valley of India, it appears that there's very, very little interest from the digital and technological private firms, except for one, but it's still part as it's looking to see how the municipal body the needs of households and also who actually do not really take into account the experience and expertise of field actors who are actually using technologies on the ground. So to try to synthesize as we can draw primary there is a strong penetration of mobile phones, even from new technology, and provided also that technologies and the design of the technologies remain very, very simple and accessible for people who may actually be illiterate. The second lesson is related to regulation and public regulation, which appears as decisive to create incentives towards the private sector, either to use technologies and data for inclusive urban development issues, or to ensure the inclusion and temper the risk of exclusion or cherry-picking strategies from the private sector towards the poorest of the poor. These regulations are decisive, but it appears that until now, local authorities are still quite disconnected or lack some form of involvement with these third-party projects that emerge from the ground. And in terms of inclusion, it appears that technologies do increase the recognition, the knowledge, so combining the lessons from the two case studies, the literature review and state-of-the-art to enrich our conceptual model to highlight the mechanisms and the conditions for successful. So we have first general which are related first launch to ensure the availability of ICTs in the city. This means the material support of telecommunication networks and infrastructure, some programs to ensure literacy, digital literacy among the urban poor, and an adequate regulatory framework for ICTs and data management. It should be noted that in our two case studies, it appears that there's very little room for maneuver for the secondary cities until now, and this is mostly dependent on national frameworks and policies. But this does not mean that nothing can be done at the local level. And as a matter of fact, to create a favorable environment and to create some factors that will lead to success in secondary cities is absolutely possible. But this requires to have some form of political willingness to consider grassroots digital initiatives, some incentives towards the private sector to develop digital solutions for the urban poor, and to create a local context of accountable governance on data as a public good to be shared and open among all and included for informal urban activities. So these are some kind of political and institutional environment that will come, as you can see here, to influence pervasively altogether the transformative processes and effects that can be expected from ICTs to inclusive outputs. There is also some more specific targeted actions that will be more at the level of project design to address the influence of ICTs in context of urban vulnerability. First of all, on the user side, users being either workers or people can seize ICTs and use them to improve their livelihoods and living conditions. To do so, the role of intermediaries in digital mediation is key, so that they can ensure the inclusion of end users in participatory design of technological solution, and to convey information to the urban poor on the potential of productive digital uses. So this is on the, I would say, the social side of ICTs. On the technological side of ICTs, you have a need of incentives to direct technological solutions towards the urban poor by paying specific attention to local market drivers and at the base of the pyramid, to develop some very frugal technologies and simple design and ensure, once again, to take into account the needs of end users into developing the solutions. It should be noted that these recommendations on the user side and the author side are actually applicable to all kinds of stakeholders, whatever the status. I mean, they can be NGOs, they can be social enterprises, or they can be startups as well. So all these elements come here in our theory of change to act actions and policies toward information and communication technologies for transformative change to happen on the one hand, but also to temper the risks and to avoid that ICTs lead to further inclusion of the poorest of the poor. In terms of recommendations, we can conclude actually by identifying some actions at the crossroad of policy and project design, and also at the crossroad of the multiplicity of stakeholders that we identified. You have 4 areas of collaboration to ensure the availability and the accountability of technologies and data. Action to ensure that technologies are appropriated by the urban poor for productive uses, and action to ensure the commitment of technological actors to meet the needs of the urban poor. So what does that mean for local authorities? What can they do? First of all, facilitate and ensure proper data management as the platform for these partnerships among all the stakeholders. Opt for local and frugal technologies rather than turn towards sophisticated, capital-intensive solutions that have been very often pushed forward by smart city help or accompany these cities towards using ICTs. A few directions for development and research partners, offer blended finance for hybrid social enterprises or startups or business models, to build the capacities of all the stakeholders, once again, with particular attention to the frontline staff and the workers on the field, and to promote proper data management as a cornerstone of renewed local governance. So to conclude, what we have looked at in this study is actually quite different from the usual knowledge on smart cities. It appears that ICTs are not only a core service for inclusion in itself, but also a lever for other services and public goods that will contribute to inclusion. It appears that this is within the reach of local authorities, even though they may be data and investment scarce, provided that they enter into multi-stakeholder governance framework that allow to pool resources and expertise and experience. The key being that much more than technology, actually, the social, economical, and political perspective towards urban inclusion is decisive. And so to finish, so smart technologies, we would tend to say that smart technologies actually will not contribute to urban inclusion automatically, unless there is this multi-stakeholder awareness, willingness, and collaboration to do so in each and every city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laure and Blanche, for your presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are now going to have commentaries from Anne and Wishfish. Then we will open for questions. Once again, I encourage you to be engaged in the discussion and send us your questions. At this moment, I would like to give the floor to Anne, who is an urban environment specialist here at Citizen Alliance, to give us some reflections on the presentation and perhaps focusing on the potential and challenges of pay-as-you-go off-grid solar systems in fostering equitable economic growth. Anne, it's over to you.
Thank you, Keith. So you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. I mean, I guess, thank you, first of all, for this really interesting presentation. And also the report is really comprehensive, I have to say, and really reflects with good case studies, some really good examples for how to use smart technologies. I mean, I could talk for I don't know, 20 minutes about distributed renewable energies and why is it so important. But I mean, looking at the time and allowing maybe for a longer discussion, I focus on some main points I wanted to make. First of all, I mean, from a climate change perspective, this distributed renewable energy, we always have to keep in mind, is not only on mitigation, meaning CO2 reduction, but for me, I see it clearly as also climate adaptation. It makes the communities more resilient and creates, and this is also came out of the report quite well, creates opportunities for equitable economic growth. What I also wanted to mention is when we talk about distributed renewable energy, we always talk mainly about low voltage systems. Which helps, of course, most of the communities in terms of lighting for work and for education. It provides electricity for information sources like radio or TV, and for, let's say, safety in terms of street lighting. But what we always forget there a bit, and this is especially important when it comes to climate change mitigation, is the case of cooking. So this could be also an interesting thing to look for smart solutions besides, let's say, solar cooking. There are a lot of pilots going on regarding solar cooking, and they work quite well. But this is clearly, let's say, the elephant in the room when we talk about distributed renewable energy. Most of the households are using charcoal or liquid petroleum, and this is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also affecting the health of the inhabitants. So this is something we should maybe look into more. And then another thing I see, I mean, besides the smart technologies, and this was also touched upon in the study, there's a need for smart policies. I mean, this is really something besides all these infrastructural questions we have when it comes to informality. I mean, the power shortage and the grid is not really working, if it's even connected to the grid. So smart policies are something we should have a closer look into. And what I also find important there would be the question of maintenance and services of these systems. So each and every approach should keep in mind, should look for, a case study was actually quite well there, for business cases. Once you have a business case for this electricity, it's not about donating distributed renewable energy systems to communities. It's about creating a market, creating business opportunities, so that you have somebody in place who is taking over the maintenance and the service if there's a problem. And for this, of course, this was also touched on in the study, you need capacity building and training on the ground. So a good solution, what I found, also GIZ is doing actually quite a lot on this, is to give small grants to community-based or small or medium enterprises to run these kind of energy systems and provide training, and then it will be a more, let's say, sustainable thing. Last point I wanted to make there, of course, the technology is important, and I mean, prices are dropping in the last 10 years by, I don't know, 70% or so for PV systems. So the market is, there is a market for it, the solutions are there. We just have to be careful. There's no, let's say, one size fits all solution there. We really have to be careful about first financial, but also cultural barriers for each of the communities, and then also getting at least a buy-in from local authorities. Yeah, I will leave it like this, but I'm happy to discuss further.
Thank you, Anne, for your insights. I would like to invite Wishfish to give us insights from the field on potentials and challenges of technologies and fostering a more productive and inclusive urban environment for the poor. Wishfish is an information technology expert in plastic waste management, and I would request that he focuses his insights on waste picking. Over to you, Wishfish.
Hi, thanks, Keith. Hi, all. Very good afternoon, and good afternoon to some of the UN counterparts from across the continent. And I'm really thankful to the Cities Alliance team for firstly having me on this call and as a discussant. And I thank Dr. Laura as well for reaching out to me and connecting with me regarding the ICT component in Bangalore, because I have worked extensively in the sector for around 4 years now, and I'm trying to push further and see if this is some area that has to be taken up really very seriously across the nation. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with UNDP currently in our plastic waste management project. And I think the number of participants that are there in this call and the kind of involvement that's been there through the session, I think it's been great. I mean, especially I'd like to point out at slide 21 of Dr. Laura's presentation, and she summed it up really beautifully. That's where all the lessons learned are being showcased. Definitely the informal sector, who's sort of the backbone in this whole setup in a developing nation like India, and they are the people who actually need to be empowered and provided with probably say enhanced technologies which are being developed across the world. It is not that in today's world, I would say that India is probably going digital on a large scale, probably thanks to the Prime Minister's push here, or perhaps a little more. Hello, am I audible, Keith?
Yes, I can. Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, all right. Okay, I'll just continue. Sorry. So I think going digital is the way forward for the nation, and even in terms of a lockdown situation like that is happening now, I think it's fair enough that being digitized sort of helps you with a lot of things, including probably say procuring your groceries and many more. So coming from the perspective of ICT in waste management. Prior to my assignment with the UNDP, I was running a startup, and that is where I think I presented to Dr. Laura a lot of scenarios that I faced as a entrepreneur as well. So the best part about the startup was that I was running this startup in partnership with an informal worker from the system, or probably a waste picker. He's probably a rag picker who's turned into an entrepreneur, and all this came together at a hackathon which happened in Bangalore. If it's okay, I can just quickly present 2 slides that I have, if that's okay, Keith.
Sure, you can. Lo, can you please stop sharing your slide? Thank you. Yeah.
All right.
You can start sharing your slide.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, I'm not going to take too much time. I'll just quickly run through a couple of slides. Yeah, the startup, were formed at, the Reimagine Waste Hackathon, which happened in Bangalore, and Gayatri Handanal, the lady here, she's the person who was running it. And of course, Dr. Laura has also interacted with Ms. Nalini Shekhar from Hasirdala. And Krishna here, you see, he's the, waste picker whom I've been running this startup in parallel with and in partnership with. And there were a lot of problem statements. Basically, there was segregation that was mandated, and the collection is always an issue because people don't know whether the collectors used to blame the people for not segregating, and people used to blame the collectors for mixing waste. And there were a lot of black spots or in these unauthorized garbage dumps and landfill issues. So basically, there was no waste collector feedback system, and coupled with ineffective segregation. And of course, the data centered around all this is not digitized and it's not from source. So the system that we pitched was a door-to-door collection and monitoring solution. And this is probably like an Ola or an Uber system for waste, wherein the waste picker would, rate the quality of segregation along with the photographic evidence based on certain segregation guidelines. And that was relayed as a two-way feedback system to both the citizens, and it would also be related to the municipal officials. So just quickly sharing a video of the collection process. So the way vehicle arrives, there's a notification that happens with the citizens in the back end, and there's also there are two apps. There's a collector app and there's a citizen app, and this is what happens on the collector app, wherein people, the collector actually, I'm sorry, this is not synchronized, but this is the best I have for now. So the waste collector superficially examines the quality of waste, gives a rating with a photographic evidence, and moves on. And in the back end, and that process continues. In the back end, in the citizen app, there is an option to track the collector and the route that he's taking. And also there's a rate card available for each and every data point that's given out. And this is something that's interesting. So their average quality of segregation on a scale of 5 is something that probably citizens used to monitor on something called the community standing graph. So if you see, there's the households distributed between 1 to 150, 0 to 150 probably, and yeah, so on a scale of 5, the average quality of segregation for households 58 and 59 is slightly lower than that of 60. That's because these guys weren't segregating waste better initially, but taking a look at their neighbors segregating well, this gamification and the chart actually helped them come back better with their segregation qualities. So I think that's quickly it. I don't want to I'm going to pause my screen share. And what I wanted to say was, why I brought this up was because, how many ever technologies come up, I think it's something that we'll have to essentially see whether it's going to be possible for citizens and, people to adopt it. It could be a top-down approach, but that's something that doesn't always work. And also, as Arn was just saying a while ago, probably say the distributed systems for energy, probably say even distributed systems for monitoring waste is something that's too difficult to happen. And that's what probably Waste Samaritan, the startup, was also about. So because you are talking about individual consumption patterns and people not being able to diligently manage their waste or segregate their waste is a challenge when they're not being their consumption is not being monitored too. So I think probably a pay as you trash system or a pay as you consume system is something that needs to be envisaged in the long run, and that is something where ICT definitely can help. And that's like a huge vision and project in itself. Probably there's a lot of privacy and other infringement issues, but I think given a proper digital framework and a whole setup, I think we should technically be able to roll out and see where all this can fit in. As Ann just said a while ago, I think probably not a one size fits all solution is going to be possible everywhere, but I think it's still going to be possible if we can work it out wherever it's going to be possible.
Thank you, Wishpech, for your insights and for that excellent presentation. I think it gives us a good view of how waste picking technologies are being applied in the field. And at this point, I think we will open for questions. The first question that I would like to pose that has been asked here, that I'll pose to our panelists, is coming from Mike. Mike is asking if there was an initial, if the researchers had contact with Waste Pick cooperative called Asiru in Dala in Bangalore.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Lo, we can hear you.
Okay, yes. Well, yes, absolutely. I met with Azirudala. It's one of the main waste workers cooperatives working in Bangalore. What I think is very, very interesting on behalf of Azirudala is that they started, as I said, as being really, really committed to the inclusion of waste pickers. And but they are now more and more looking at what can ICTs do to improve these working conditions and revenues of waste pickers. And so they have actually partnered, well, they are actually part of UNDP project on plastic waste management, but they also partnered with startup, which, as I said, is corporate social responsibility initiative for a large technological group, which is called I Got Garbage. And I Got Garbage is actually an app that has been developed and which is used by waste pickers in some dry waste collection centers to actually follow up and monitor the waste they are receiving and sorting. So once again, it's still pilot phase. The app is still adjusting some functionalities and design with the workers, but they are like one of the typical examples of these NGOs/social enterprises who are trying to partner and use ICT solutions for and with waste workers.
Okay, thank you, Lo. I hope that that answers the question. Because of time constraints, I'm going to allow just two more questions. The first question is from Josh, and is asking if you are aware of any other examples where your recommendation for a collaborative multi-stakeholder approach to fostering smart technologies has been implemented in the Global South.
Well, I think that actually, for example, once again, the UNDP project is quite a good example in India on plastic waste management. It is a partnership between UNDP, Unilever, and Coca-Cola to implement actually extended producer responsibility solutions. And so you have these funding partners, and then you have Azirudala as the waste picker cooperative for everything which is on the social side of using technologies and empowering for workers. And you have this private startup tech firm, I Got Garbage, to develop digital dashboard, comprehensive dashboard. For example, this is not necessarily at the level of public governance or local policy, but it's an example of multi-stakeholder approach. Another example would be the campaign from Slum Dwellers International, which is called Know Your City, which is a campaign for mapping and participatory addressing of informal settlements by and with local inhabitants in informal settlements, where you have tech actors from OpenStreetMap training inhabitants in mapping their own settlements, and then the NGO of Slum Dwellers International supporting the whole process of generating information and developing some kind of media and communication. The challenge then that will really depend on each city will be the involvement and consideration given by local authorities to this kind of grassroots initiative, but it's also a multi-stakeholder initiative combining different resources, technical, social, and financial resources.
Okay, thank you, Lo. Wish I will allow you to answer the question regarding to whether you'll be able to provide links to resources on the example that you explained.
Yeah, sure. I think I can share it with you, Keith. You can probably, I think I've shared it with Dr. Laura as well, perhaps. And there is one online presentation on Google Drive that I have, and people will need to download and then probably view it in presentation mode because there are multiple layers to each slide. I think that's okay to share by me.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for the excellent presentation, and also thank you for our participants who joined us today. We have come to the end of this webinar. The webinar will be recorded and it will be shared on the Cities Alliance website. For those who are interested, you can check it later on. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.